In 1932, the Australian Army declared war on birds, and it lost. Real soldiers, real machine guns, against a flock of confused, hungry birds that could not fly. This actually happened. It is called the Great Emu War, and it is, somehow, completely real. To understand how a modern army got beaten by a flightless bird, we have to start somewhere unexpected. We have to start with the wheat. After the First World War ended, Australia had a problem. Thousands of soldiers came home from the trenches, broken and exhausted. And the government had promised them something to come back to: land. That was the deal. Become a farmer, grow wheat for the empire, and a slice of the empty Western Australian outback is yours. It sounded generous. It was actually a trap, because the land was terrible. Bone dry, baking hot, and a punishing distance from anywhere. The kind of soil that fights you for every single seed. But these were stubborn men, so they tried anyway. And by 1932, after years of brutal work, they had finally coaxed a real wheat crop out of the dust. Golden, ripe, and worth actual money. Their reward was finally here. And then they looked up at the horizon. 20,000 emus, marching out of the dry interior in one of their great seasonal migrations straight toward the only green food for hundreds of miles, which happened to be the farmer's wheat. Emus are not little birds. They stand around 6 feet tall, they sprint like racehorses, and they are built like feathery battering rams. And these ones had just found a free, all-you-can-eat buffet that stretched to the horizon. They trampled the crops. They flattened the fences. And worst of all, those broken fences let swarms of rabbits pour into the fields too. The farmers stood there watching everything they had built get devoured from 2 directions at once. Now remember, these were not ordinary farmers. These were ex-soldiers. Men who had survived a world war. So when the birds came, they did the most natural thing they could think of. They asked the army for machine guns. A group of them traveled to meet the Minister of Defense, a man named Sir George Pierce. And here's the strange part. He said yes. Why? Partly to help the farmers. Partly to show the government was doing something. And partly, he just thought it would be excellent target practice. There was also a publicity angle. A newsreel crew was sent along to film the whole thing, so the government would look strong and decisive on cinema screens across the country. It was supposed to be great propaganda. What could possibly go wrong? The man chosen to lead this glorious campaign was Major G.P.W. Meredith of the 7th Heavy Battery, Royal Australian Artillery. His army? 2 men. Sergeant McMurray and Gunner O'Halloran. Their weapons? 2 Lewis guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. 10,000 rounds for a few hundred birds. The math seemed wildly in the Army's favor. The math was about to get embarrassing. On the 2nd of November, 1932, the Army rolled into the Campion district. The plan was about as simple as a plan can get. Find the emus, aim the guns, pull the trigger. How hard could it possibly be? They spotted a flock right away. About 50 birds. The soldiers grinned. This was going to be easy. But there was one tiny issue the Army had completely failed to plan for. Emus are not soldiers. They do not line up in neat rows. They do not hold formation. And they absolutely do not stand still and wait to be shot. The moment the gun opened fire, the flock exploded outward. The emus scattered into small groups and sprinted in zigzags, faster than anyone expected. The Lewis guns rattled. Bullets flew everywhere. And the emus, for the most part, just kept running. A handful of birds went down. The rest were already specks on the horizon. The Army had barely made a dent. Major Meredith was not discouraged. He just needed a smarter approach, so he came up with a new plan. An ambush, a perfect trap. He would let the emus come to him and walk right into the line of fire. Near a dam, over 1,000 emus gathered to drink. The soldiers waited, hidden, hearts pounding. This was it. The perfect shot. Meredith gave the order. The gunner squeezed the trigger. The gun fired about a dozen rounds. And then it jammed. And just like that, the perfect ambush was over. The emus heard the brief rattle, calmly looked up, and trotted off into the scrub like nothing had happened. 1,000 birds, almost all of them, completely untouched. Here is where the story stops being funny for the Army and starts being humiliating. The emus learned. After a couple of encounters with the guns, the birds stopped gathering in big, easy-to-hit flocks. Instead, they broke apart into small, scattered bands. And each band, observers noticed, seemed to have its own tall, watchful bird standing guard. An ornithologist watching all this later wrote that the emus had, in his words, split into small units, each with a leader. They were using guerrilla tactics. The moment a gun appeared, the lookout would sound the alarm, and the whole band would vanish before a single shot landed. Birds. Doing reconnaissance. And then there was the other problem, the really annoying one. Emus are absurdly, ridiculously hard to kill. Their dense feathers and tough bodies meant they could take several direct hits and simply keep running like nothing had happened. Major Meredith was genuinely impressed. He said if his men had the bullet-stopping toughness of these birds, they could face any army in the world. He was complimenting the enemy. Mid-war. That is roughly when you know the war is not going well. Meredith refused to give up. If the emus were too fast to chase on foot, then he would bring the chase to them. So he came up with a bold new idea. He bolted one of the Lewis guns onto the back of a truck. On paper, it was genius. Drive the truck right alongside the running emus and mow them down at speed. No chasing required. Meredith was very proud of this one. There was, of course, a catch. There's always a catch. Emus can run at around 30 miles an hour, and they can turn on a dime. Over the rough, broken, rock-strewn outback ground, the truck simply could not keep up with them. And bouncing along at full speed, the poor gunner could not aim at anything. The ride was so violent that the gunner was thrown around like a rag doll. Then the truck chased a bird straight into a fence and crashed. One emu apparently got tangled in the steering and the truck went out of control. The bird, naturally, walked away fine. By now, word of the whole circus was getting out. And the newspapers, which were supposed to be filming a triumphant campaign, had stopped praising the operation entirely. Instead, they were openly laughing at it. The story reached the House of Representatives in the nation's capital. Politicians stood up and openly mocked the entire campaign right there on the floor of Parliament. It was suggested, only half-jokingly, that the emus should be given medals. They were, after all, winning. And the Minister of Defense, the man who had so cheerfully approved this for fun target practice, now had to stand up and answer for it. The target practice, it is fair to say, was not going to plan. So on the 8th of November, after just 6 humiliating days in the field, the government quietly pulled the army out and recalled the guns. The Great Emu War, round 1, was officially over, and it had not gone well. Let us look at the scoreboard. Around 2,500 rounds of ammunition fired in the first run. Confirmed emu kills? A few dozen. The emus had taken thousands of bullets and barely flinched. The army packed up and went home. The birds stayed and kept eating, but the farmers were not done. The emus were still out there, and the crops were still being flattened every single day. So the desperate farmers did the truly unthinkable. After all that, they begged the army to come back and try again. And incredibly, after a few days, the government actually agreed. So Major Meredith packed up his guns once more and returned to the field around the 12th of November for a second attempt. Round 2. This time, surely, it would be different. And this time, Meredith was a little smarter about it. He hunted in the early morning when the birds were active and moving, and instead of chasing huge flocks, he picked them off in smaller, steadier numbers, day after day after day. By the time it ended in December, Meredith claimed about 986 emus killed using 9,860 rounds. Do that math. That is about 10 bullets for every single bird, 10 rounds per emu. And there were tens of thousands of emus. And even if every single number Meredith reported was generously true, the cost was still insane. Because here is the simple, brutal math of it. You cannot win a war when the enemy outnumbers your bullets. So the army quietly gave up for good. The emus had won. Officially. It is the only war on record that birds can claim they won outright. They brought in a bounty system. Pay the farmers a small reward for each emu and let them handle it themselves. And it was brutally effective. They brought in a bounty system. Pay the farmers a small reward for each emu and let them handle it themselves. And it was brutally effective. Within 6 months, farmers claimed bounties on over 57,000 emus. The farmers, it turned out, were far deadlier than the entire army had ever been. And the lesson here was almost insulting. The mighty army, with its machine guns and trucks and 10,000 bullets, had failed. But a bunch of patient farmers, motivated by a tiny cash reward, quietly succeeded where the soldiers never could. The farmers, by the way, asked the army for help 2 more times in later years. Both times, the army politely said no. Once was a national embarrassment. The army had absolutely no intention of going back for thirds. And the emus? They never knew there was a war at all. They were just hungry, flightless birds wandering toward the nearest meal. They did not out-strategize anyone on purpose. They were just too fast, too tough, and too many. And that was enough. So the next time someone tells you a problem is impossible to beat, remember this. In 1932, the Australian Army went to war against birds. They brought machine guns, trucks, and 10,000 bullets. And the birds won. If you enjoyed this disaster, subscribe for a new piece of dark history every week. And tell me in the comments which war you think was dumber.